The colonization of America changed the course of history forever. What began as a voyage for wealth and power became a centuries-long struggle that shaped nations, cultures, and identities. But beyond the well-known stories of Columbus, Jamestown, and the Pilgrims lies a deeper, more complex reality. One of conquest, survival, resistance, and transformation. How did a handful of European explorers claim an entire continent? What untold stories of the indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and forgotten settlements have been lost to time? And how did these early battles for dominance lay the foundation for the United States we know today? This is not just history. This is the story of how America was built. Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind the colonization of America in this gripping documentary. The story of America's colonization did not begin with the United States. It started long before, with European empires racing across the Atlantic in search of power, wealth, and new lands. The Spanish were the first to carve their place into the New World, leaving a legacy of conquest, settlement, and conflict that would shape the entire Western Hemisphere. When Christopher Columbus began his journey in 1492, he was not looking for America. His goal was to find a faster trade route to Asia. But instead of silk and spices, he found vast lands inhabited by civilizations that had flourished for thousands of years. In just a few years, Spain had established control over the Caribbean, using these islands as stepping stones for further expansion into the continents. By the early 1500s, Spanish explorers like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro had led brutal conquests against the Aztec and Inca empires. Gold and silver circulated from the Americas into Spanish treasuries, making Spain the most powerful empire in Europe. But colonization was never just about wealth. It was about control. To secure their dominance, the Spanish established permanent settlements. One of the earliest was Santo Domingo, founded in 1496, making it the first European city in the New World. Over the next few decades, Spanish colonists spread across Central and South America, planting the seeds of an empire that stretched from present-day California to Argentina. Other European powers were eager to stake their claims in the New World despite Spain's early dominance. France, the Netherlands, and England watched Spain grow rich from its colonies. They wanted their share of America's untapped resources. The French ventured north, exploring the lands that would become Canada. The Dutch and Swedes focused on the mid-Atlantic coast, while the English turned their eyes toward the unclaimed lands further south. In 1607, the English finally established their first permanent colony at Jamestown. This was no easy feat. The settlers, unprepared for the harsh conditions, faced starvation, disease, and conflict with the native Powhatan people. Many perished in the first few years. But despite these hardships, Jamestown survived, fueled by the introduction of tobacco farming, which would soon become the backbone of the American economy. The English approach to colonization was vastly different from the Spanish. While Spain had built cities and intermarried with native populations, the English saw the indigenous people as obstacles to be removed. Over time, their settlements grew, pushing deeper into native lands and sparking conflicts that would last for centuries. By the 1620s, another group of English settlers arrived, not for wealth, but for religious freedom. The Pilgrims landed in Plymouth in 1620, seeking a new life away from religious persecution in England. Unlike Jamestown, Plymouth's settlers formed tight-knit communities, creating a foundation for what would later become New England. While English colonies expanded, the French built a different kind of empire. Rather than focusing on large settlements, they established a vast network of trade outposts along the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, and the Mississippi. The French relied heavily on alliances with Native American tribes, working with them to control the lucrative fur trade. Unlike the English, who pushed natives off their land, the French often lived among them, intermarrying and adopting local customs. By the late 1600s, the battle for America was fully underway. The Spanish controlled vast territories in the south, the French dominated the interior, and the English built thriving colonies along the Atlantic coast. Tensions between these empires grew, setting the stage for a century of conflict over who would ultimately control North America. And so, as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the struggle for dominance intensified. Colonization was no longer just about exploration. It was about survival, power, and the foundation of what would eventually become the United States. By the late 1600s, colonization in America was no longer a matter of simple exploration. The lands that European powers had claimed were not empty. Millions of indigenous people had lived there for centuries and were unwilling to surrender their homelands without a fight. At the same time, as settlements expanded, the European empires found their ambitions clashing, setting the stage for a brutal struggle over control of the New World. The arrival of European settlers had already devastated native populations. Disease, introduced through trade and warfare, wiped out entire communities. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread like wildfire, with mortality rates as high as 90% in some tribes. But despite these losses, indigenous groups resisted colonization at every turn. The English settlers in New England quickly found themselves in violent conflicts with the region's native tribes. The Pequot War of 1636 to 1638 saw the near destruction of the Pequot people, with hundreds massacred and the survivors sold into slavery. A few decades later, tensions erupted again in King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. King Philip, also known as Metacom, led a coalition of tribes against the English colonists, who were rapidly seizing native lands. Entire towns were burned, thousands were killed, and in the end, the English emerged victorious, tightening their grip on New England. Further south, in Virginia, another major uprising challenged English authority. Bacon's Rebellion, in 1676, was initially a conflict between English settlers and Native Americans. Still, it soon became a larger struggle between wealthy landowners and poor frontiersmen who wanted more land to settle. The rebellion was crushed, but it exposed a growing divide in colonial society, one that would later shape the racial and economic systems of America. Meanwhile, in the interior, the French and their Native American allies waged their resistance against English encroachment. Unlike the English, the French had developed strong ties with many indigenous nations, particularly the Huron, Algonquin, and later, the powerful Shawnee. These alliances made it far more difficult for the English to expand westward, leading to a series of conflicts that would only intensify in the coming decades. While indigenous groups fought to defend their lands, European powers battled for dominance in America. Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands had competing claims, and as the colonies grew, so did the tension between them. The Dutch, who had established New Amsterdam, modern-day New York City, in 1624, quickly became a target for English expansion. In 1664, the English seized the colony without firing a single shot, renaming it New York. The Dutch briefly recaptured it in 1673, but lost it again a year later, cementing English control over the region. To the south, Spain held on to Florida and much of the Gulf Coast, but struggled to maintain its power. Expanding from their Carolina colony, the English raided Spanish settlements and allied with local indigenous tribes to weaken Spanish influence. The Spanish, in turn, encouraged enslaved people in the English colonies to escape to Florida, promising them freedom if they converted to Catholicism. This policy led to the establishment of Fort Mose in 1738, the first free black settlement in what is now the United States. The greatest struggle for America came between England and France. Both empires had extensive colonies, but their approaches to colonization were vastly different. With fewer settlers, the French relied on trade and diplomacy, while the English focused on permanent settlements and agricultural expansion. This difference in strategy made conflict inevitable. Though the European struggle for America had ended, a new battle was beginning. The British government, eager to recover financially, enacted a series of measures that would spark outrage in the colonies. The Sugar and Stamp Act of 1764 and 1765 placed heavy financial burdens on the colonists, who had no representation in Parliament. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. Tensions escalated further with the Quartering Act, which forced colonists to house British troops, and the Townshend Acts, which imposed more taxes. The situation reached a boiling point with the Boston Massacre in 1770, when British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. Resistance grew. The Sons of Liberty, led by figures like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, organized protests and boycotts. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party, an event that resulted in colonists dumping British tea into the harbor, provoked harsh retaliation. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, known as the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, further tightening control. By 1775, open conflict was inevitable. In Lexington and Concord, the first shots were fired, setting the stage for the American Revolution. Colonization had led to conflict, and conflict had led to revolution. The struggle for dominance in America was no longer just between European empires, it was now a fight for independence, for the birth of a new nation, the United States of America. The American Revolution was not just a war. It was a movement fueled by ideas of liberty, self-governance, and resistance against tyranny. In June 1775, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as head of the newly formed Continental Army. Though inexperienced and poorly equipped, Washington's forces engaged the British in key battles, including the costly but morale-boosting Battle of Bunker Hill. By 1776, the colonies took a decisive step toward independence. The Second Continental Congress enacted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson. This historic document declared the colonies free from British rule and outlined the people's rights and self-government that would define the new nation. The war raged on. The British, with superior numbers and resources, captured major cities, including New York and Philadelphia. But American forces, aided by militias and foreign allies, kept the fight alive. In 1777, the turning point came at the Battle of Saratoga, where American forces secured a crucial victory, convincing France to join the war as an ally. Spain and the Dutch Republic soon followed, turning the revolution into a global conflict. Despite hardships, including the brutal winter at Valley Forge, Washington's leadership held the army together. In 1781, with French naval support, Washington's forces trapped British General Cornwallis at Yorktown. Cornwallis surrendered, effectively ending major combat. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized American independence. Britain ceded vast territories to the United States, marking the birth of a new nation. The Revolution had transformed America from a collection of colonies into an independent republic, setting the stage for its rise as a global power. The story of America's rise to power is one of conflict, resilience, and transformation. From the early days of colonization to the struggle for independence, Each chapter of history played a pivotal role in the forming of the United States. But this is only the beginning. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more compelling stories of America's past and the forces that shaped the world we live in today.